My maid of honor showed up to my wedding wearing a white dress, not off-white, not cream, white. She had known the dress code for 11 months. She stood in every photograph next to me in white on purpose. Tonight every single story is about something that went wrong on the one day that was supposed to be perfect. 5 weddings, 5 betrayals, 5 moments the bride had to decide in real time what she was willing to accept. This is the part that gets me every time. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. My name is Amanda. I am 30 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, and 13 months ago I removed my maid of honor from my wedding mid-reception after discovering she had deliberately worn a full white dress despite 11 months of explicit communication about the dress code, and after receiving confirmation from 2 other bridesmaids that she had told them weeks earlier that she intended to wear white specifically because she believed the wedding should have been hers, given that she and my now husband had dated briefly in college before he and I met. My maid of honor's name is Kayla. She had been my best friend since middle school, and when my now husband Ryan and I got engaged, she had genuinely seemed thrilled to be asked to stand as my maid of honor, despite the fact that she and Ryan had dated for approximately 4 months in college, a relationship that had ended amicably years before Ryan and I even met, and that I had never considered a significant issue, since it long predated our relationship and Kayla had always described it, when it came up at all, as a minor college fling rather than anything serious. I want to describe the 11 months leading up to the wedding because the dress code had been communicated with unusual specificity, given a previous incident at a friend's wedding where a guest had worn white and caused a minor scene. I had sent a group message to the entire bridal party 11 months before the wedding, explicitly stating that no shade of white, ivory, or cream would be appropriate for anyone other than myself, and had followed up individually with each bridesmaid, including Kayla, to confirm they understood and had selected appropriate dress colors. Kayla had confirmed in writing that she understood, and had even sent me photos of a burgundy dress she claimed to have purchased for the occasion. On the wedding day, Kayla arrived at the venue in a full-length white dress, not subtly off-white or a color that could be mistaken for a mistake, but unmistakably bridal white, a dress style that 2 other bridesmaids told me privately during the reception closely resembled a dress Kayla had shown them weeks earlier while saying, according to their account, that she deserved to look like a bride too since she had dated Ryan first and things could have gone differently for her. I want to describe what happened when I first saw Kayla in this dress, arriving just as photos were beginning. I was, understandably, deeply upset but made the decision with my wedding planner's help to proceed with photos without immediately confronting her, not wanting to disrupt the ceremony itself over what I initially hoped might have some explanation, however unlikely that seemed given our explicit prior communication. It was during the reception, after 2 bridesmaids independently approached me to share what Kayla had said in the weeks leading up to the wedding, that I made the decision to act. I asked my brother and Ryan's brother to escort Kayla out of the reception, explaining to her directly, in a private area away from other guests, that her deliberate violation of the dress code, combined with what I now understood to be a calculated attempt to draw attention to her history with Ryan on my wedding day, was not something I was willing to continue accommodating at my own wedding. Update 4 months later. Kayla has not apologized for what she did, instead characterizing my response as an overreaction to what she describes as simply wearing a dress she liked, a framing that conveniently ignores the 11 months of explicit communication and the statement she reportedly made to other bridesmaids about believing she deserved to be a bride at my wedding. Our friendship, which spanned over 15 years before this incident, has ended completely. I have not spoken to Kayla since the night of the wedding, and mutual friends have told me she has expressed to others that she believes I overreacted and destroyed a friendship over a dress code. A characterization that continues to frustrate me given what the full context actually included. Ryan and I have discussed this extensively, and he has been fully supportive of my decision, expressing his own discomfort at learning, well after our wedding, the specific things Kayla had apparently said to other bridesmaids about believing the wedding should have been hers. I have processed a significant amount of grief over losing a friendship of this length, but remain confident that removing Kayla from the reception, rather than simply enduring what would have been a deliberately disruptive presence for the rest of the evening, was the right decision given everything I ultimately learned about her intentions that day. Kayla wore white, on purpose, and just like Amanda, had to make a real-time decision about what to do with a bridesmaid's betrayal. The bride in story 2 had to make a decision too, but hers was not about a dress. It was about a toast her own mother had been planning for months, designed to embarrass her in front of everyone she had ever known. Wait, this is the part that gets me most. Here is what happened. My name is Jennifer. I am 29 years old. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, and 15 months ago I instructed my wedding DJ to cut my mother's microphone during her reception toast, after she used the moment, in front of 180 guests including my new husband's entire extended family who were meeting most of my family for the first time, to announce that I had been adopted as an infant, a fact she had never previously discussed publicly, and that I had specifically and repeatedly asked her, in the weeks before the wedding, not to mention, having made the decision that my adoption was a private matter I would discuss with my new in-laws on my own timeline rather than having it announced, unplanned, at my wedding reception. My mother's name is Deborah. She is 62 years old and had, throughout my engagement, expressed general disapproval of what she considered my husband Michael's family being, in her words, too proud and reserved, a characterization rooted in what I now understand was a deep insecurity about how her own family, considerably less wealthy than Michael's, would be perceived at the wedding. I want to describe the specific context of the toast, because it did not begin as an announcement about adoption. It began as what seemed like a standard, warm mother of the bride toast, discussing my childhood and how proud she was of the woman I had become. Approximately 3 minutes into the toast, my mother pivoted, stating that she wanted Michael's family to truly understand what an extraordinary journey I had been on, explaining that I had been adopted at 6 weeks old after my biological mother, a teenager at the time, had been unable to care for me, and that despite this difficult start, my mother and father had raised me to become the successful, accomplished woman standing before everyone that evening. I want to describe what this felt like in real time, standing at the head table in my wedding dress, hearing my mother reveal, unplanned and unauthorized, information about my origin that I had never discussed with most of the people in that room, including several of my own close friends who had known me for years without this detail ever coming up, because it had simply never felt relevant to share, and I had never wanted my adoption to be the defining fact people knew about me. I signaled to my wedding planner, who understood immediately given prior conversations we had had about my specific wishes regarding this topic, and she relayed instructions to the DJ to cut the microphone, which occurred just as my mother was beginning to elaborate further on details about my biological mother that I had never even shared with her in full, having pieced together only partial information from my mother over the years, and never having fully explored my origins myself. The room went quiet in the specific way that happens when technology cuts off mid-sentence and everyone understands something deliberate has occurred. I stood up, took the second microphone reserved for speeches, and said, calmly but firmly, that I appreciated my mother's toast but that I wanted to redirect the evening back to celebrating Michael and me, and asked the band to resume music, effectively ending the moment without further public discussion. I did not confront my mother during the reception itself, wanting to preserve what remained of the evening, But the conversation that followed 2 days after we returned from our honeymoon was one of the most difficult I have had with her in my adult life. Update 4 months later. My mother has struggled to understand why I was so upset, repeatedly characterizing the toast as a celebration of my resilience rather than an unauthorized disclosure of private information I had specifically asked her not to share. She has apologized, though the apology has consistently included qualifications suggesting she still does not fully grasp why the specific venue and audience made this disclosure inappropriate regardless of her intentions. Michael's family, to their credit, have been entirely gracious about the situation, with his mother telling me privately, weeks after the wedding, that my origin story did not change anything about how they viewed me, and that she appreciated my own choice to share such details on my own terms going forward rather than having them dictated by someone else's toast. My relationship with my mother remains strained. I have significantly limited how much personal information I share with her going forward, having learned painfully that boundaries I believed were clearly established could still be violated in public, high-stakes settings if she believed her own narrative of the moment justified overriding my explicit wishes. I have, since the wedding, begun exploring my own adoption records independently, a process I had previously avoided, feeling that my mother's unauthorized announcement had, in a strange way, forced a conversation I had been putting off having with myself about wanting to know more about my origins on my own terms rather than continuing to avoid the topic entirely. Deborah revealed a secret that was never hers to tell. In front of 180 strangers. Our final wedding tonight. Story 3 is about a mother-in-law whose betrayal was not a spoken toast at all. It was something far more calculated, something planned for over a year, that the bride only discovered when it was too late to stop it. This is the part that stays with me. Here is what happened. My name is Rachel. I am 32 years old. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and 18 months ago I discovered, for months before my wedding, that my mother-in-law had secretly had her own 40-year-old wedding dress altered to fit my exact measurements, obtained without my knowledge through a bridesmaid's dress fitting she had attended months earlier under the guise of general interest, planning to present it to me as a surprise with the clear expectation, communicated to my fiancé weeks before she revealed this to me, that I would wear it instead of the dress I had already purchased and had been altering for the previous 6 months. My mother-in-law's name is Susan. She had, throughout my 2-year relationship with her son David, expressed repeated interest in the idea of me wearing her wedding dress, a hope I had gently but consistently redirected. Having found a dress of my own that I loved and that reflected my own style rather than the considerably more traditional, high-neck design from Susan's 1985 wedding. What I discovered 4 months before my own wedding was that Susan had not accepted my previous polite declines as final answers, and had instead taken matters into her own hands, obtaining my measurements from a bridal shop where I had gotten fitted for bridesmaid duties at a friend's wedding the previous year, information she had apparently requested from the shop under false pretenses, claiming to be coordinating a surprise gift for a family member. She had then taken her own dress to a specialized vintage gown restoration service, had it altered to my exact measurements, and revealed this to David, expecting him to present the surprise to me as a romantic gesture that would presumably move me to abandon my already purchased dress in favor of this family heirloom. I want to describe how I learned about this, because David, to his credit, did not simply go along with his mother's plan. He came to me directly, clearly uncomfortable, and explained what his mother had done, including her explicit request that he help convince me to switch dresses, framing it as an opportunity to make his mother happy while wearing something with sentimental family value. I want to describe what it felt like to learn that my mother-in-law had gone to these lengths, obtaining my private measurements without consent and spending considerable money altering a dress specifically to make it harder for me to say no, believing, apparently, that the sunk cost of the alterations combined with the emotional pressure of a family heirloom would override my previously expressed preferences. I told David clearly that I was not willing to wear Susan's dress, that I had already chosen and was continuing to alter a dress that reflected my own vision for my wedding day, and that I needed him to communicate this to his mother directly and firmly, making clear that the decision was final and that I found her method of obtaining my measurements without consent to be a significant overstep regardless of her intentions. David had this conversation with Susan, which he described afterward as extremely difficult, given his mother's clear emotional investment in the plan and her visible hurt at my refusal. Update: 4 months later. Susan has struggled considerably with my decision, and our relationship has been noticeably strained in the months since, though she has not repeated any similar attempts to override my choices for other aspects of the wedding planning. I did wear my own dress at the wedding 3 months ago, a decision I have never once regretted despite the ongoing tension it has caused with Susan. In an unexpected turn, Susan asked, approximately 6 weeks before the wedding, whether she could wear her own altered wedding dress herself as a guest, since it had already been restored and fitted, even though the fitting had technically been to my measurements rather than her current size, requiring a second round of alterations to accommodate this new plan. David and I agreed to this, finding it a reasonable compromise that allowed the dress to be worn and appreciated without requiring me to wear something I had never wanted for my own wedding. Susan wore the dress to our wedding, and while I found this choice somewhat unusual given the dress's original purpose and her plan, I have chosen to view it as a resolution that allowed everyone to move forward, even if the underlying tension about her attempt to override my wishes has not been fully or explicitly addressed between us since. Susan altered a dress to fit measurements she was never given. Our fourth story tonight is about a betrayal that happened not before the wedding and not during it, but immediately after. On the wedding night itself, when the bride discovered something about her new husband that no one had warned her about, something hiding in his own phone. Let that sink in. Here is what she found. My name is Melissa. I am 34 years old. I live in San Antonio, Texas, and 10 months ago I left the hotel suite where my husband and I were supposed to spend our wedding night, checking myself into a different room alone, after discovering a series of text messages on his phone, sent throughout the reception itself, arranging to meet his ex-girlfriend during a portion of our upcoming honeymoon that he had specifically planned to include a solo golf outing, an activity I had never questioned given his stated love of the sport and my own lack of interest in joining him for it. My husband's name is Brandon. We had dated for 3 years before marrying, and his relationship with his ex, a woman named Ashley, had ended approximately 18 months before Brandon and I started dating, a history I had known about generally but had never had reason to view as an ongoing concern, since Brandon had always described the relationship as firmly in his past. I discovered the messages by accident, reaching for what I believed was my own phone from the small clutch I had set on the head table during the reception, and picking up Brandon's phone instead, which had an active text conversation visible on the lock screen notification, a message from a contact saved simply as Ash that read, in part, "So excited to finally see you again after all this time. Can't wait for our afternoon together during your trip." I want to describe what happened when I looked more closely, waiting until a quiet moment during the reception to check further, scrolling through a conversation that had been ongoing for approximately 6 weeks, since shortly after our engagement announcement had become public on social media, revealing that Brandon and Ashley had reconnected, initially through what appeared to be innocuous catching-up messages, but escalating over subsequent weeks into increasingly personal conversation, culminating in specific plans for Ashley to fly to the same destination as our honeymoon, time specifically around the golf outing Brandon had planned as time away from me, with explicit discussion between them about keeping the meetup private from me. I want to describe what it was like to read these messages during my own wedding reception, in my wedding dress surrounded by everyone we knew, having just committed to a lifetime with a man who had spent the weeks leading up to our wedding planning a secret meeting with his ex during what was supposed to be our honeymoon. I did not confront Brandon during the reception, not wanting to create a scene in front of our guests, many of whom had traveled significant distances to be there, but I made the decision, once we reached our hotel suite that night, that I was not willing to spend our wedding night pretending everything was fine while carrying this knowledge. I showed Brandon the messages I had photographed from his phone, and his reaction, initial denial followed by minimizing the plans as merely catching up as old friends despite the specific and clearly private nature of the arrangements, confirmed for me that this was not something I could simply move past that night, or possibly at all. Update 4 months later. I filed for annulment within the first month of our marriage, a process our state allowed given the extremely short duration of the marriage and the specific circumstances involved, rather than pursuing a divorce, which felt to me like an important distinction given that I did not consider what we had built a marriage worth formally ending through the divorce process, but rather a mistake that needed to be legally undone as cleanly as possible. Brandon has attempted contact multiple times since the wedding night, characterizing his communications with Ashley as innocent and claiming he never intended to actually follow through with meeting her, an explanation I have found impossible to reconcile with the specificity and secrecy of the plans I read in his own messages. I have not responded to any of his attempts at contact. My family has been enormously supportive throughout this process, several of my closest friends having told me, only after the wedding night incident, that they had always had reservations about Brandon that they had never voiced, not wanting to interfere in what appeared to be a happy relationship. I have spent the months since in therapy processing not just the immediate betrayal, but the broader question of what other things I may have missed or chosen not to see during 3 years of dating someone capable of planning this kind of deception during the very weeks he was also planning our wedding. I do not know if I will ever fully understand why Brandon did what he did, but I am certain that discovering it on our wedding night, rather than during the honeymoon itself when the planned meeting would have actually occurred, allowed me to make a decision from a position of knowledge rather than continuing forward in ignorance. Brandon planned a secret meeting during his own honeymoon. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about a wedding betrayal. That did not come from a spouse or an in-law or a bridesmaid. It came from the person who was supposed to be the most excited of all, the father of the bride. And what he did was not something he said or wore or planned in secret. It was something he simply refused to do at the exact moment it mattered most. This is the last story, and it may be the one that stays with you longest. Here is what happened. My name is Christina. I am 27 years old. I live in Orlando, Florida, and 14 months ago my father informed me, 3 weeks before my wedding, that he would not walk me down the aisle unless I removed my stepfather, my mother's husband of 12 years, from the guest list entirely, an ultimatum that came after years of tension between my parents following their divorce 16 years earlier, but that had never previously escalated to demands about my own wedding, an event I had specifically planned to include both of my parents and their respective spouses, having maintained relationships with all 4 of them throughout my life and considering my stepfather, who had been present for most of my childhood after my parents' divorce, a genuinely important figure in my life alongside my biological father. My father's name is Gerald. He had never fully reconciled with my mother's remarriage, despite it having occurred over a decade earlier and despite my stepfather, Mark, never having done anything to create conflict with him beyond simply existing as the man my mother had chosen after their divorce. I want to describe the specific ultimatum, because it came without warning 3 weeks before the wedding, during what I had believed was a routine planning call to discuss final logistics. My father stated, without room for negotiation in his tone, that he had thought about it and simply could not walk me down the aisle knowing Mark would be present, watching in what he described as an insult to his role as my father, and that I needed to choose between having him walk me down the aisle or including Mark at the wedding at all. I want to describe what this ultimatum did to the 3 weeks leading up to my wedding, a period that should have been filled with final preparations and anticipation, but that instead became consumed by an impossible choice between two people who had both been present and important throughout my entire life. I attempted multiple times over the following week to reason with my father, explaining that Mark's presence was not intended as any commentary on my father's role in my life, that I loved and valued both men for different reasons, and that I was not willing to exclude someone who had attended my childhood recitals, helped me move into college, and supported me through difficult periods, simply because my father had never made peace with my parents' divorce. My father did not relent. 5 days before the wedding, having exhausted what felt like every possible avenue for compromise, I made the decision that I was not willing to remove Mark from my wedding to satisfy an ultimatum that felt fundamentally unfair to ask of me on my own wedding day. I called my father and told him that Mark would remain on the guest list, and that if this meant he was unwilling to walk me down the aisle, I understood and respected his decision, but that I hoped he would reconsider and attend regardless, even without that specific role. My father did not attend the wedding at all. Update 4 months later. My uncle, my father's own brother, walked me down the aisle instead, a decision he made, he told me afterward, because he believed my father's ultimatum was unreasonable, and he did not want me to walk alone on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. My father has not spoken to me directly since the wedding, communicating only briefly through my uncle to express that he stands by his decision and believes I chose Mark over him, a characterization I have found deeply painful given that I never asked him to choose anything, only asked that he not force me into an impossible choice between two people I love for entirely different, non-competing reasons. My mother and Mark were, unsurprisingly, devastated to learn the reason behind my father's absence, and Mark specifically has expressed guilt, despite my repeated reassurances that his presence at my wedding was never something I was willing to negotiate away, regardless of my father's feelings about a marriage that occurred over a decade ago and that had nothing to do with him. I have spent considerable time in the months since processing grief over my father's absence from my wedding, a loss that feels different from the typical father-daughter conflicts, given that this was not a disagreement we could simply move past through time, but a specific irreversible absence from an event that will never happen again. I have reached out to my father twice since the wedding, hoping to find some path toward reconciliation that does not require relitigating his ultimatum, but he has responded both times only by restating that he stands by his position, leaving our relationship in a painful, unresolved state that I continue to hope, though without much current evidence to support the hope, might eventually find some resolution.